The cameras were rolling. The audience was laughing. Johnny Carson was in the middle of his monologue, delivering another perfectly timed joke about the week's headlines. And then, without warning, he stopped. Not a pause for effect, not a beat for laughter, he stopped. His hand went to the desk, the smile faded. He looked past the cameras, past the lights, into the third row of the audience where a man in a dress uniform had just stood up. The studio fell silent. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet. Ed McMahon's pen hovered over his notepad. For the first time in 30 years of live television, Johnny Carson had broken his own format. This is the story of the night the Tonight Show stopped being a show and became something no one in that studio would ever forget. It was a Tuesday in February 1982. Studio One at NBC Burbank was alive with the controlled chaos that defined late-night television. The audience had been seated since 4:30 p.m., warmed up by a staff comedian who told them when to laugh, when to clap, and most importantly, never to stand unless instructed. Johnny Carson walked onto that stage every weeknight with the precision of a Swiss watch. Monologue at 11:35, guest interviews at 11:50, musical act or comedy bit by 12:20, closing remarks at 12:50. For 3 decades, millions of Americans had set their lives to that rhythm. Carson was consistency, Carson was comfort, Carson was control. But that night, something was different. The audience didn't know it yet. The production crew didn't see it coming. Even Carson himself wouldn't understand it until the moment arrived. But in the third row, center left, sat a man named Robert Hendricks, 62 years old, silver hair cropped military short, a navy dress uniform that looked like it had been pressed that morning, but worn for a lifetime. He hadn't wanted to come. His daughter Linda had surprised him with tickets for his birthday. "You love Johnny," she'd said. "You watch him every night." And it was true. After his wife passed 2 years earlier, Carson had become Robert's companion. 11:35 p.m. every night, the sound of laughter in an otherwise silent house. But sitting in that audience, surrounded by strangers, Robert felt the weight of something he'd carried for 40 years. It wasn't supposed to surface tonight. He'd learned to bury it. But then Carson started talking about veterans, about a new memorial being built in Washington, about remembering those who served, and something inside Robert Hendricks cracked open. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. It happened so fast that most people didn't register it immediately. Carson had been smiling, delivering a line about politicians and parades, when his eyes caught movement in the audience. A man rising to his feet, not to leave, not to heckle, just standing, ramrod straight, hands at his sides, eyes forward. For a moment, Carson didn't move. The cameras kept rolling. But Johnny Carson, the man who had interviewed presidents and movie stars without missing a beat, stopped reading. He set down his cue cards. He turned away from camera one. "Sir," Carson said, his voice quieter than anyone in the studio had ever heard it. "Sir, are you okay?" The audience turned. 300 people shifted in their seats to see what Johnny Carson was seeing. A veteran standing alone in a sea of seated strangers. His jaw was tight. His eyes were wet. Robert Hendricks hadn't planned to stand. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was the way Carson said the word, "remember?" Maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying ghosts no one else could see. Maybe it was the first time in 2 years that someone had asked him if he was okay. "I'm sorry," Robert said, his voice barely carrying past the first few rows. "I didn't mean to." He was already moving, stepping out from behind his desk, walking down the 3 carpeted steps that separated the stage from the audience. "Don't apologize, please." The crew backstage exchanged glances. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't in any script. Producer Fred Deckardova reached for the phone to call the control room, but his assistant put a hand on his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Just wait." Carson reached the edge of the stage and stopped. He was close enough now that the studio microphones picked up everything. The audience was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the stage lights. "What's your name?" Carson asked. "Robert. Robert Hendricks." "Robert, were you in the service?" "Yes, sir. Navy. Korea." The way Robert said Korea carried the weight of something unspoken, something that couldn't be joked about or packaged into a late-night television segment. Carson heard it. Everyone heard it. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Robert's throat worked. He nodded. "My brother James." He was 19. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Full of every person in that studio suddenly understanding that they weren't watching entertainment anymore. They were witnessing something raw, something real. Carson didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it breathe, let it mean something. And then in a voice that carried no performance, no artifice, he said, "Thank you for being here tonight, Robert. Thank you for standing up." It was the simplest sentence, but the way Carson said it, steady, direct, honoring, it landed like a eulogy, like a promise, like the words Robert Hendricks had been waiting 40 years to hear. The audience began to clap. Not the prompted applause of a warm-up comedian, not the rhythmic beat of a talk show transition. This was different. Slower, heavier. One person, then 10, then 50, until the entire studio was on its feet. Doc Severinsen, who had played for presidents and legends, felt his eyes burn. Ed McMahon, who had laughed through 10,000 shows, wiped his face with the back of his hand. And Johnny Carson, who never let the mask slip, stood at the edge of that stage and let the moment be exactly what it needed to be. But Carson wasn't done. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. When the applause finally faded and the audience settled back into their seats, Carson didn't return to his desk. He didn't pick up his cue cards. He didn't crack a joke to reset the energy. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was. Where he was. "Robert," Carson said, "would you come up here for a second?" The request hung in the air. Robert hesitated. His daughter squeezed his hand. "Go," she whispered. The walk from the third row to the stage felt longer than any deployment. Robert's legs moved on autopilot, the same way they had decades ago when orders were barked and you didn't ask questions. He climbed the 3 steps, stood under the lights, faced Johnny Carson. Carson reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper worn at the edges. The kind of thing that had been carried and refolded so many times it threatened to disintegrate. "I'm going to tell you something I've never said on this show," Carson began. "My father was Navy Pacific Theater. He came home in 45, and he never talked about it. Not once. Not to me, not to my mother, not to anyone. The studio was a held breath. When I was 16, I found a letter in his desk. It talked about a man my father served with. A friend who didn't make it home. The chaplain wrote that my father had tried to save him, that he'd carried him through gunfire, that he blamed himself for not being fast enough." Carson's voice didn't waver, but something in his eyes did. "I never asked him about it. I was a kid and I didn't know what to say. And then he passed and I never got the chance. But I kept that letter. I've carried it for 30 years. And tonight, watching me stand up, I realized something." He unfolded the paper. The studio lights caught the edges yellowed with age. "This letter isn't just about my father. It's about every man who came home carrying someone else's story. Every person who stood when no one asked them to. Every quiet act of courage that doesn't make the evening news." Carson looked directly at Robert. "So this is for you, and for James, and for everyone who didn't get to hear this." He held out the letter. Robert's hands shook as he took it. He didn't read it, didn't need to. The gesture was enough, the acknowledgement, the witness. And then Johnny Carson did something no one expected. He saluted. Not a casual gesture, not a television moment. A full, formal regulation salute, held until Robert on instinct returned it. The audience erupted. Not in applause this time, in something deeper, a collective release. Tears and cheers, and the kind of noise that comes when people realize they've been holding something in for too long. Doc Severinsen lifted his trumpet and played a single long note, clean and clear and mournful. Ed McMahon stood from his chair. The crew in the rafters stopped working and just watched. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home ever saw coming. Carson turned to camera 1. The red light blinked. 30 million people were watching. And Johnny Carson, who had built a career on never getting too serious, who always knew when to break tension with a laugh, looked directly into that lens and said, "If you're watching this at home, and you've served, or you've lost someone who served, I want you to know something. You're not forgotten. You're not invisible. And what you carry, what you've carried, it matters." He paused. The kind of pause that felt like a punctuation mark in history. We tell a lot of jokes on this show. We laugh. We keep things light. But some things don't need a punchline. They just need to be said. So I'm saying it. Thank you to all of you. Thank you. The broadcast continued, but no one remembered what came after. The scheduled guest was politely moved to another night. The comedy sketch was cut. Johnny Carson sat at his desk with Robert Hendricks in the guest chair, and they talked. Not an interview, not a segment. Just two men talking about fathers and brothers and the weight of memory. When the show ended, Carson walked Robert and his daughter to their car. No cameras, no crew, just a handshake in a parking lot under a California sky. The next morning, NBC's phone lines were overwhelmed. Thousands of calls, letters arrived in boxes, veterans and families, and people who'd been carrying their own silent burdens. They all said the same thing. Thank you for seeing us. The letter Carson gave Robert that night was framed and hung in Robert's living room. It stayed there until he passed, 10 years later at age 72. In his will, he requested it be donated to the National Archives, with a note from one son to another, so the stories don't disappear. Johnny Carson never spoke about that episode publicly. He didn't need to. The people who were there remembered. The people who watched remembered. And in the years since, it's become one of those moments that gets passed down, not through official channels, but through the quiet retellings of those who understand what it meant. Because that night, Johnny Carson reminded an entire country that television didn't have to be just entertainment. It could be a mirror. It could be a moment. It could be the place where someone finally felt seen. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The Tonight Show continued for another 10 years after that night. Johnny Carson interviewed astronauts and actors, politicians and comedians. He told 10,000 jokes and made America laugh through recessions and elections and everything in between. But the people who worked on that show, the crew, the band, the producers, they all remembered February 1982 as the night Johnny stopped being an icon and became something more. A man who understood that some silences matter more than applause, that some moments don't need a script, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop the show and let someone stand. In the archives of NBC, buried in thousands of hours of footage, that episode still exists. Unedited, raw, a single segment where the laugh track goes silent and something else fills the space. Something that doesn't translate well to highlight reels or viral clips. It's the sound of one man standing and another man stopping everything to honor it. That's the thing about Johnny Carson's legacy that doesn't fit neatly into retrospectives. It wasn't just the jokes or the timing or the perfect interviews. It was the moments like this, ones where he understood that his platform wasn't his alone. That the desk, the lights, the cameras, they could be used to do more than entertain. They could be used to heal. Robert Hendricks never appeared on television again. He didn't want to. But every year on the anniversary of his brother's death, he'd receive a card in the mail. No return address. Just 2 words written in familiar handwriting. Still standing, Johnny Carson sent those cards until the day he retired. And when Carson passed in 2005, Robert's daughter found one more. It had been postmarked a week before Carson's death, delivered posthumously by an assistant who'd been instructed to send no matter what. Inside, just 4 words. Your brother is proud. Some nights don't need a punchline. They just need to be remembered.